Hello everyone, welcome to the 11th day of eSchool on Climate Science and Policy. Today is also the second to last day of eSchool. We hope you found the sessions useful and informative, and thank you for being supportive yesterday during the technical glitch. In case you have missed any of the previous lectures, you can find them on our YouTube channel. Please ask your questions in the link provided below in the description. Lastly, I would like to request everyone to fill the feedback form, and the link will be provided to you soon, and it will mostly be in the description. Today we have with us Professor Parthasarathy. D. Parthasarathy is India Value uh, Fund Chair Professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. He is also an associate faculty convener of the Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies and Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay. He has earlier worked or held visiting positions at the Australian National University, National University of Singapore, and Zentrum Moderner Orient Berlin. He has carried out research projects and published in the areas of urban studies, resource governance, legal pluralism, gender and development, climate studies, and disaster risk and vulnerability. His current research is on coastal transformation and vulnerability, ocean conflicts and sustainable transformations. Today he will be discussing about the topic introduction to risk and vulnerability. We welcome you, Professor. Over to you.
Thank you, Sindhuja. Yeah, thank you. And thank you also to all the participants of this e-school on climate science and policy. We hope that you've been actively participating in this course for the last couple of weeks and have benefited from it. We are very happy to hear that there are a small but significant number of committed participants who not only listen to each of the lectures every day but also actively participate in the discussions afterwards. So our major objective in this summer school is firstly to um, develop increased awareness about the science and policy aspects of climate change in a very in-depth way, so that those who are interested either in research or in taking up higher education on climate studies can do so. Uh, and for that, we are very keen to have those who are motivated um, in the topics that we've been covering so far. So we also welcome quite a few researchers and other professionals because these are like many of us faculty members here in the IDP in climate studies. We became interested in climate related issues uh, later in our lives. Some of us, of course, started out working on this in our PhDs itself. But many of us have been working in other related areas and then came to climate studies, and we see many such participants for this e-school as well. We are very happy to welcome all of you because capacity building is one of the key objectives of this summer school as well as of the IDP in climate studies. And as I mentioned in the inaugural day, the IDP in climate studies is sponsored partly by the Department of Science and Technology, Government of India, under the National Action Plan on Climate Change, with a specific mandate to develop increasing capacity of researchers working in diverse areas of climate studies. Uh, so today, we are once again welcoming you for this session, and uh, it's a continuation of the topics that we've been handling till now, and we'll be specifically focusing on issues related to risk and vulnerability. The primary reason why we are interested in studying climate change is because of the kind of impacts that it has. So, if the impacts of climate change are mostly in areas where uh, human population densities are low, or where the impacts are mostly on natural systems and not on human systems, perhaps the interest would not be so much. So the impacts of climate change, whether in terms of tropical storms and cyclones, sea level rise, droughts, varying precipitation patterns, these are acutely felt by human systems. in many different ways, affecting different sectors like agriculture, energy, transportation, health, and they also have adverse impacts in terms of the natural hazards and disasters that these impacts create, especially in terms of floods in coastal India and the severity of droughts faced by the agricultural sector. Therefore, the uh, study of vulnerability to climate change becomes very important because we want to more clearly understand how these impacts translate into adverse effects for different human systems. And related to the concept of vulnerability are other concepts like risk and exposure, sensitivity, hazard, uncertainty, and so on. Uh, we do not have sufficient time in this 1 hour that's given to us to go into all of these in detail. Uh, those who are interested can get in touch with us, and we'll also be providing you a bibliography of online sources which you can look up. So the idea here is to provide a short introduction to the concepts, the framing of the concepts of risk and vulnerability, and how these can be assessed or measured. Again, normally when we've been having this e-school earlier, because of the larger amount of time available to us, we did carry out hands-on exercises and tutorials on the measurement of vulnerability. Unfortunately, in this online mode, we are not able to do that, but we will provide you links to substantial material that is available online, some of it developed by us, which if some of you are interested in getting into measurement issues more seriously, you can look up that material. Now, when I say that the idea of this particular module is to introduce you to basic conceptual and theoretical issues of risk and vulnerability to climate change, I'm not going to be only focusing on definitions. So one of the key aspects here is for us to think about how we frame these issues of risk and vulnerability, how we frame them with reference to climate change, and how we frame them with respect to the particular context of India and South Asia in particular. So, drawing from several decades of research on risk and vulnerability, not only with reference to climate change, but also with drawing from research in psychology, in sociology, in economics, in political science, and other disciplines, these concepts have uh, been defined in many different ways depending on how we wish to use them, which context we want to apply them to, which kind of natural hazards we are talking about. But one of the key issues that arises from the fact that these concepts derive from social sciences is that these concepts are what we call as multivocal. That is, they are open to interpretation in different ways. Therefore, I will be going a little bit into the issue of how we frame issues of risk and vulnerability because in actual research, uh, it's almost impossible to directly translate a concept, operationalize it, and measure it. So, a considerable amount of analytical and theoretical uh, work has to be done before we decide which kind of definition to use in what context. And for that, we even need to think about our own motivations as to why we are studying vulnerability and how we want to translate this understanding or knowledge into policy. So that is
Sir,
the large, sorry, yeah,
you're still on the first slide of
I'm still on the
PPT.
first slide. Yeah,
Please.
yeah, I'll be moving. Yeah, I just wanted to give an
Okay.
introduction. And then, okay, so with this introduction, we'll get into understanding how concepts of risk and vulnerability have been framed, especially in the last couple of decades, with particular reference to climate change. Now, vulnerability today is one of the key organizing concepts for research on global change or global climate change. So, all the reports of the United Nations, the IPCC, the UNFCCC, the state and national action plans, so much of research about climate change impacts use the term vulnerability to understand how impacts of climate change adversely affect human and natural systems and what we can do about that. So once we recognize the centrality of vulnerability as an organizing concept, then we begin to ask some of the questions that I've posed on this slide about what exactly is vulnerability, whose vulnerability that are we talking about, there's which section of the population are vulnerable or more vulnerable, and also the question of when people are vulnerable. So when we talk of successive climate related hazards which keep occurring year after year, so at what stage or what cycle do they become more vulnerable, or maybe even if people, communities, governments learn to deal with, cope, adapt to these hazards, then maybe they even become less vulnerable. Okay. And also, how do people become vulnerable? What kind of changes are required either in governance or political systems, economic shifts, or breakdown in social systems which make people more vulnerable? So before we proceed further into the definition and framing of these concepts, a very basic idea of the linkages between different concepts is something that is necessary, because we often see that even with the best of research, a lot of in-depth fieldwork, there is often a confusion about the links between these different concepts. So this particular diagram shows how the exposure to a particular hazard deriving from climate change leads to vulnerability, and therefore how we then use this understanding of vulnerability to design better adaptation solutions. So we start with a particular climate related hazard. Take sea level rise, or a tropical cyclone, or a drought. So there can be a particular system, which can be a human system or a natural system, a city, a district, a community, a sector like agriculture or transport or energy, which are exposed to that particular hazard. So, because of the nature of this hazard and because of the nature of the scientific understanding of these hazards, there will always be some degree of uncertainty about what will be the impact of this exposure to a hazard on a particular system or on the elements of a particular system. Now, generally, we say theoretically that if there is uncertainty, it is very difficult for any system to deal with that uncertainty. How do we understand it? How do we cope with it? How do we take measures of precaution to protect ourselves, to minimize damage, and so on? So, the step from uncertainty to risk happens through knowledge and research. So, and that is true not only with reference to climate change, but in life in general. So just take a simple example of insurance, where we have simple and complex algorithms to convert uncertainty into risk, based on which insurance policies are worked out, whether for human beings or for health illnesses or even for agriculture or crop loss. So research and knowledge is necessary about the kind of exposure we have to a danger, and what is likely to be the impact of that, what is likely to be the occurrence of a particular hazard. Then we convert uncertainty into risk. So risk is something that is manageable, uncertainty is something that is very difficult to manage. So once we convert uncertainty into risk, we have a much better idea of whether we are vulnerable, how vulnerable we are, and what can we do about it. Also about who is vulnerable, who is more vulnerable. So the risk can be understood in terms of which sectors, which regions, which communities, which sections of the population, older, younger. In what way? Is it in terms of health? Is it in terms of loss of life? Is it in terms of loss of assets, loss of income? So the different aspects of vulnerability become clearer once we understand the risk. Now, with reference to the last two parts on top there, so an understanding of vulnerability can help us to design better adaptation solutions to minimize risk, to minimize damage. At the same time, we must remember that having better adaptive capacity also minimizes our vulnerability. Okay, so later on, when we go into adaptation a little bit, we'll talk about it. We don't have enough time to focus on adaptation as a concept here. So we're going to focus more on vulnerability in this particular lecture. But we must remember that societies which are more, or systems which are more prepared in terms of adaptive capacity, they are less vulnerable, which means that they have already recognized the risk and have reduced their exposure, reduced their vulnerability to a particular hazard. So let me give you a little bit of the history of the understanding of vulnerability. So even though uh, serious attention to the problems of climate change dates back to the early 90s, even though there has been much research and thinking even before that. So if you look at the IPCC reports, uh, it was only when it came to the fourth assessment report of the IPCC in 2007 that vulnerability is even taken seriously. Till then, what is called as the physical science basis was given more importance. That is, understanding climate change itself, what are the contributors to climate change, and what are the different impacts was given more importance. But what are the actual outcomes in terms of adverse consequences for human beings, for human systems, human activities, was not taken seriously, even in the 2007 report. As a result of which, even though vulnerability as a concept was identified, defined, theorized in the 2007 report, the usefulness of this understanding was very limited because, firstly, the time dimension or the temporal dimension, that is, in what time scale can we anticipate different kinds of impacts of climate change? So is it something that is going to happen in the next 100 years, next 50 years? How many extreme events of a particular kind are going to happen in the next 10 years or in the next 50 years? uh, what kind of time do we have to prepare ourselves against these extreme events? How frequent are these events likely to be in the next 50 or 100 years? These are topics which are very important for us in adaptation, very important for us in designing policies. However, this was not adequately covered in the 2007 report. Also, a second point, and which is especially very important for India and South Asia in particular, was the focus on a particular risk, that is, the increase in global mean temperature. That is, usually we talk of 1.5 degrees from the beginning of the period of industrialization in the 18th century up to 2100. What is likely to be the mean change in global temperature, which is usually discussed in terms of a scenario of 1.5 degrees increase, or some scenarios also talk about 2 degrees. Now, the impact of climate change is not only in terms of global warming, it's also in terms of a number of other kinds of impacts. And one of these impacts, which is especially very significant for India, is the impact of global climate change on the Indian summer monsoon, or the ISM as we call it. We're in the middle of the monsoon right now. So we have a lot of research which shows that there is considerable variability to the monsoon, which already is, highly variable. So that variability is getting complicated. The average rainfall during the summer monsoon, annual average, is declining, but we also see an increase in high intensity precipitation or rainfall events, and we also see uh, other kinds of changes in seasonality and weather patterns in terms of the onset and retreat of rainfall, the number of the wet spells and dry spells during the monsoon itself are changing. And this is hugely important for a country like India, where a majority of the population depends on agriculture. We also know in India that the whenever there is a drought year or a bad monsoon, it affects not only agriculture but the overall economy, because there are spill-offs from the agriculture sector to the rest of the economy, and this has political implications also in terms of how the government is seen to manage the crisis caused by a bad monsoon. So politically, economically, in terms of human lives, costs, food security at the household level in rural areas, nutrition security, all of these depend on a good monsoon, stable monsoon. So the impact of the climate change on the Indian summer monsoon is considerable, but it's not given adequate importance at the global level in global level research and policy making. And therefore, this is something that countries like India and in general in Asia have been fighting to get greater recognition in global research and policy making. And it's something that we are still fighting about because it's not adequately recognized by the rest of the countries who are more interested in the changes in global mean temperature. Also, as is evident from what I've just been saying for the last few minutes, uh, there was very little understanding of the distinction between impacts and vulnerability. So just because we are exposed to a hazard doesn't mean that we are vulnerable. So vulnerability depends on uh, governance policies to deal with disasters, on how resilient a society is or a community is, the education level, the levels of income, economic growth, the infrastructure. So the largest socio-economic and political context is very important for enhancing adaptation capacity. And therefore, just because you are exposed doesn't mean your vulnerability. And that confusion persisted for a long time in both Indian and global research. It was assumed that just because you're exposed to a hazard, you're vulnerable, which is not necessarily true. So this diagram, which came in the last assessment report of the IPCC in 2014, right now we are working on the sixth assessment report. This particular framing improved upon the framing of the issue of risk and vulnerability. The limitations were there were attempts to overcome the limitations that I showed in the previous slide. Uh, I can go into great depth on this particular diagram, but we don't have enough time, so I'll just explain it very briefly. So what you see here are the human interventions, which is at the bottom of this slide, in the form of emissions and land use land cover change. If you are familiar with the contributors to climate change, the three most important contributors are emissions, um, land use land cover change, and aerosols. Okay, so these can lead to what we call as anthropogenic climate change, but we also recognize, uh, as we see here, that even without the impact of human beings, there is a natural variability to climate change. That is, climate change is climate is constantly changing by itself as well as part of the planetary system. So we need to understand, we need to attribute the specific changes we are observing now to anthropogenic causes, that is, to human interventions. Now, if you go to the right side of this slide, you have different kinds of socio-economic processes. So these socio-economic processes, the pathways that we are talking of, if we fail to recognize climate change as a serious issue, we may end up contributing more to emissions and land use change. But if we do recognize that this contributes to anthropogenic climate change, then these socio-economic pathways can be modified so that our emissions and land use change, land use cover reduces. We are actually contributing to mitigation of global warming and climate change. At the same time, while there is a need to mitigate, we also recognize that anthropogenic climate change and natural variability create certain kinds of hazards for human and natural ecosystems. So we need to adapt to these hazards. So a simple example would be setting up cyclone shelters in areas which are more prone to tropical storms and cyclones. So, or changing, advising farmers to change their cropping patterns because of increasing frequency of droughts. So we need mitigation, we need adaptation to reduce the our exposure to hazards, and all of these require certain systems of governance. And we see in countries around the world how political leaders either deny that climate change is happening, or deny that there is anthropogenic contribution to climate change, or they fail to act upon their knowledge. So governance leadership is very important in altering the socio-economic pathways and in designing and implementing efficient adaptation and mitigation actions. Now let me come to the middle part of this. So we know that natural variability and anthropogenic climate change create certain kinds of hazards to human and natural ecosystems. And there are certain systems that are more exposed to these hazards. Not everyone is equally exposed. So, for example, the east coast of India is more exposed to tropical storms and cyclones than the west coast of India. Okay, so these create risks for human beings. Now, the difference between key and emergent risk is something that's very important for us to remember here, because that tells us about the point that I made in a previous slide about vulnerability, that vulnerability is not just exposure to a hazard, vulnerability is not just impact of climate change. Vulnerability is also related to inherent internal vulnerability or endogenous vulnerability of a system because of poor governance, because of uh, poor adaptation mechanisms, or because of high levels of poverty or illiteracy and so on. So that aspect is incorporated in the idea of key and emergent risk. The concept of key risk tells us that you may have the risk of being impacted adversely by a particular climate hazard, but you may already be vulnerable, either because you are a refugee, you're a migrant, you come from an economically poor background, uh, the government policies you're not able to access. You're not able to access information which helps you to prepare and adapt better to climate change. You may not have access to certain kinds of technologies. So, because of these, there is an inherent vulnerability in the system itself or in a community. The combination of the two kinds of vulnerabilities are referred to as key vulnerability, because there is an added dimension here. Now, emergent risk goes a step further, that if there is an adverse impact of climate change and a particular system or a component of a system are not able to deal with that risk, they take certain actions which exacerbate the risk and make them more vulnerable. Okay, that is referred to as emergent risk. And a simple example here would be, so suppose there is frequent flooding in a particular area, or there is increasing frequency of droughts. So there are 3 years of consecutive droughts, because of which people may move from one particular area in search of livelihoods or food to another area, imposing additional stress on the environmental system, the social system, the economic system of that area. For example, there are some studies which are saying that the Syrian crisis, where millions of refugees moved away and were absorbed in different countries around the world, the Syrian civil war, are partly to do with climate change, where uh, there were a series of droughts and failure of agriculture. There was a impact on the economic system, so people could no longer cope. It was beyond their coping capacity to deal with the kind of livelihoods crisis they were facing, and they had no option to move. And this also happened because there was an authoritarian rule which just did not care about the kind of problems that people were facing, or forget about climate change. And therefore they moved to other places uh, in very large numbers, and added to the existing pressure on the ecosystems, the political system, the social system, and so on. Okay, so that is referred to as emergent risk. So what we are trying to do in this particular diagram is to say that there is an interaction between, on the one hand, the physical climate system, and there is an exposure of certain components of the human and the natural system to the hazards emerging from the physical climate system. And this exposure has the potential to make certain social systems more vulnerable. Okay. Now, based on this schematic that I outlined in the previous slide, we can look at certain propositions that are usually advanced in the literature, in research, on the relationship between risk, vulnerability, and adaptation. So, and cover them very briefly because I've already explained this in detail earlier. So uncertainty has been to be converted into risk through research and knowledge. Okay, uh, it's not always possible because climate science is still, in some cases, not so advanced that we can completely reduce uncertainty. A good example would be to predict the path of a cyclone. So we can predict the general path, but sometimes cyclones do change direction. Cyclones may gather more energy and increase in intensity, or it may reduce in intensity. So because of this, sometimes we are not often able to give uh, concrete, accurate advice to people who are likely to be affected by cyclones, and therefore the uncertainty persists, because of which the risks and vulnerability increase, and unfortunately more people are affected by this. Okay, so sometimes it's very difficult to manage a risk even when we correctly understand the risk. That is, we have converted uncertainty into risk through knowledge, but we may not be able to manage the risk effectively because of political failure, because we do not have enough economic resources to invest, for example, in cyclone shelters, or the leaders are not interested in this. In the United States, for example, during Hurricane Katrina, it came out that uh, the, there were a lot of warnings given about the potential impact of of a severe hurricane, as they call it in the United States, and protective measures were advised, but the government did not want to spend money on those protective measures, which, because of which there was a huge adverse impact in terms of loss of life and property. So uh, also, as I said earlier, adaptation is not just something that happens after you become vulnerable. Sometimes we may recognize that we are vulnerable and therefore put in place strategies which considerably reduces our vulnerability. Uh, Also, as I said, vulnerability is not simply exposure to a hazard or a disaster event. It comes from other socio-economic factors, one's own position in society. For example, migrants or refugees are much more vulnerable because they may not have a say in decision making. They may not have access to food during a time of disaster. They may not have access to the basic rights of a citizen. Uh, and their income levels may be low. They may have instability in their incomes. So because of these factors, they have higher levels of vulnerability, and that is what we refer to as the endogenous aspect of vulnerability. Whereas the exogenous shock is the climate related hazard itself. So therefore, a combined understanding of vulnerability is that it is a function of exposure to hazards, geography, where you are located, demography. For example, Mumbai usually figures among the top 5 cities in the world in terms of vulnerability to climate related hazards, because it's one of the most dense settlements in the world. So density matters in terms of, so if there is a super cyclone, for example, more people are likely to be affected. Social status and position, there is a lot of studies which talk about in India, for example, in terms of gender and caste and poverty. In the United States, in terms of race and poverty, how these make certain communities, certain groups of people much more vulnerable. And of course, what kind of institutions we are able to have, whether the government is able to set up these institutions to adequately do research, to convert knowledge into policies and implement those policies effectively. All of these matter in terms of how a particular component of the human system is vulnerable. So this definition, which is coming after the 2007 assessment report of the IPCC, gives a slightly more comprehensive definition. Okay? So it talks about how vulnerability is to do with the impacts of climate change, of global change, but it also brings in the endogenous dimension, that human environment systems are not only exposed, but their low capacity to adapt for various reasons that I've outlined earlier also makes them vulnerable. And the opposite of that, that uh, there may be less exposure, but because there is endogenous vulnerability, therefore there is greater risk. uh, on the other hand, there may be systems which are where there is a lot of poverty, low economic ability to address risks, but they may be less exposed, and therefore there is less vulnerability. So all kinds of permutations and combinations we can think of here. So This provides us kind of overview here of the different understandings of vulnerability and how it has evolved over a period of time. So the first one is used to be the most popular definition, but it's not generally not used nowadays because uh, it essentially refers to vulnerability purely in terms of defenselessness, that people don't have the means to cope with or adapt to an external hazard, but it doesn't recognize the feature of exposure to a hazard, and therefore by itself it's not adequate as a concept to refer to vulnerability to climate change. Likewise, number two is also a very limited kind of definition because it only talks of exposure to climate change, but not of the internal endogenous vulnerabilities arising from the socio-economic system. Okay. Uh, the number three, which came from the UNFCCC Committee of Parties 6 meeting, uh, refers to both a natural or a social system. And one particular concept, susceptibility, is introduced here, as well as sensitivity. Uh, those of you who are interested in following up can look up the glossary of terms given in the IPCC AR reports about the difference between vulnerability, sensitivity, and susceptibility. Again, there is a lot of debate about whether they mean different things, whether they are the same. But essentially, what we are saying is vulnerability is with reference to the characteristics of a socio-economic system and the exposure to a hazard. But within a social system, there may be different components who are adversely affected in different ways. So the rich may be less affected because they have access to certain kinds of coping mechanisms. With COVID-19, we are seeing, for example, that around the world, those who are very rich can protect themselves in different ways by going and living in farmhouses or in remote areas and islands, whereas the poor have to go to work. The rich can afford to stay at home, the poor cannot. So susceptibility refers to the degree of vulnerability of different components of a human or natural ecosystem, whereas vulnerability refers to an entire sector or an entire system as such. And that aspect of susceptibility is included in the fourth definition here, where we are talking about the degree to which a particular system is susceptible to or unable to cope with. So, uh, for example, you take exposure to a tropical storm or cyclone. So, to what extent is agriculture in coastal areas susceptible? To what extent is transportation as a sector susceptible? To what extent is industry or infrastructure susceptible? So, the degree to which different sectors, different components of a system are susceptible are also aspects which are included in the study of vulnerability as per the fourth definition here. So, to summarize our understanding of vulnerability that we have been discussing so far, we can see there are three axes or components of this. One is the exposure itself, which is a necessary condition for us to talk about vulnerability, exposure to a climate related hazard. The sensitivity or the degree of susceptibility, how, who, when they are likely to be affected, and the adaptive capacity, that is how well we are prepared to deal with the adverse impacts of a hazard. Okay, so these three are essential aspects of the definition of vulnerability. But again, there has been a rethinking about this, whether how much importance should we give to exposure, how much importance should be given to sensitivity, and therefore, depending on uh, which particular perspective or approach you want to use, you can give lesser or more weightage to each of these. Uh, Very briefly, I would like to also talk about how we understand risk, because so far I've been talking about risk purely in terms of its relationship to the issues of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. So, a very general and widely accepted um, way of defining and measuring risk is to see it as a function of three things: the exposure to the hazard, the vulnerability, both endogenous and exogenous, uh, and the actual hazard itself, the nature of the hazard. So, the obviously the risk to a severe storm will be different from that of a super cyclone. The risk to a hazard like drought or sea level rise will be different from that of sea level, will be different from that of a storm. So the actual hazard also matters here. But what is important to recognize here is that all three of them together not just constitute risk, but they carry different levels of uncertainty. So the occurrence or frequency of a hazard, the actual exposure to a hazard, in what way we are vulnerable, when, who, all of these are uncertain. So therefore, when we say that risk is a function of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, we are also saying that we have done research, come up with knowledge to, in some ways, reduce this uncertainty to convert it into a risk. Now, that is where this idea of perception becomes very important. So, it's not simply a question of actual empirical measurement of risk, but how this is understood and perceived. So, there may be governments, political leaders, communities which tend to neglect risk even though it is very real, and we are seeing it with covid-19, for example, and how in many countries people think it's a hoax. People refuse to wear masks, refuse to practice physical distancing, refuse to do follow the instructions about hand washing, sanitation, and so on. And that is true of other kinds of risks as well. So it could be for many reasons. It could be that people understand risk, but they still go ahead with the risk anyway. So fishing communities may feel that if I keep away from fishing in the sea because of the warning of a cyclone, then I'm going to lose income for those few days. Farmers may be aware of the risks from droughts, but they may be unwilling to change their cropping pattern purely because they lack access to technology or information, or they may not get access to loans or to finance from money lenders or banks for this change in cropping pattern. Or farmers may be more interested in commercial crops as opposed to food crops, or vice versa, and because of which they perceive risk in particular ways. So, this risk perception is something that's very important in determining how groups, communities, governments actually respond to that risk in terms of adaptation or reducing vulnerability. And therefore, we say that with this broader understanding of vulnerability and risk, we can talk of two kinds of vulnerability, that is biophysical vulnerability and social vulnerability. So initially the focus was more on biophysical. Eventually we learned to recognize that social vulnerability is important, and currently we have learned to recognize that the vulnerability to climate change is a function of both endogenous or social vulnerability, which comes from social status, lack of power, income inequality, poverty, and so on, and the exposure to a set of hazards. So, from looking at vulnerability purely in terms of the likelihood of occurrence, we've moved to the characteristics of a person or group in terms of their both of these have been combined together to yield the more comprehensive understanding of vulnerability that we use with reference to climate change now. And in actually studying or measuring vulnerability, usually we look at these four sets of parameters, and one can include more. One can define these in very different ways, but just to give you an indication of how we actually carry out studies on vulnerability, you can identify the parameters in terms of physical vulnerability, economic vulnerability, infrastructure, and the social vulnerability. Yeah, the social aspect is the actually the adaptation aspect, but adaptation also is in terms of infrastructure, because infrastructure can be destroyed during because of a natural hazard, but infrastructure also enables us to quickly move relief, rehabilitation, to help people during a particular natural hazard. So it's both adaptation, but it also indicates more vulnerability if a lot of infrastructure is susceptible to damage because of a natural hazard. So again, the way in which we actually measure these different parameters is to aggregate these different parameters, and one can take a simple average, one can do different kinds of ranking, one can give weightage to different components depending on what we are interested in. Okay, we don't have enough time to go into this, those who are interested in going to this in more detail, there's a lot of literature available on this. Okay. A little bit as we move towards the end, I would like to focus on understanding the actual nature of vulnerability, particularly in the kind of geographical region we live in India, in South Asia, and in Asia. And partly because, as I said, much of the global literature on this, including those from the United Nations, tend to focus on the average global mean temperature rise and not enough on the kind of specific climate change related risks faced by countries in Asia or in South Asia. So, a number of studies show that Asian cities are much more exposed and vulnerable to disasters. And this is partly because some of the most densely populated, large in size, and economically important cities in Asia are located in coastal areas, whether it's Hong Kong or Shanghai or Singapore or even Mumbai. So these are cities which are commercially, administratively very important, contribute significantly to government revenues. Mumbai is a very good example of that, biggest contributor to central government and state government revenues compared to any other city or even state in India. They contribute to employment, significant contribution to GDP. With global linkages, if something happens to Mumbai, there is again a spillover effect on the economy in other parts of the world as well. And increasingly, China, India, these these cities, large cities, also have a lot of foreign direct investment, and therefore any adverse climate-related hazard will lead to high risks. So there are some estimates which show that some of these cities, in fact, contribute to 65 to 90% of economic activities of those countries. And they're also magnets for migrants from rural and small towns who find job opportunities as well as educational opportunities and health facilities in these big cities. And so, because of these, Asian cities are in general more exposed and vulnerable to disasters. We also see from a lot of scientific research that these coastal large Asian cities are much more exposed to climate hazards such as sea level rise. They have significant important marine ecosystems like mangroves or wetlands, which are environmentally important. They are important from disaster mitigation perspective. They reduce the intensity of storm surge and of flooding, and they're also exposed to a lot of extreme weather conditions. So floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, the diseases because of that, many of them are also located in the tropics. The tropical weather is conducive to keeping certain vector-borne diseases sustained for a long time, like malaria and dengue. And we've also been seeing that there have been number of industrial accidents, nuclear accidents in many of these cities, which also exacerbates the kind of vulnerability that these cities already have. So the map below shows us the location of many of these Asian cities, and you can see that most of these cities are located in the coastal areas, with the exception of a very few. We also see, so the larger the circle, the larger the population size and density of these cities. So you can see some of the most large, densely settled, densely populated settlements in Asia are located in coastal areas, and that tells us about the vulnerability to climate related and other kinds of disasters of Asian cities. And some of the data that we have shows that the 40 to 50% of the natural hazards happen in Asia. Close to 60% of the deaths due to natural hazards are from Asia. And in general, if you take the overall impacts in different ways, health, livelihoods, loss of assets, lives, close to 90% of the impacts are felt by communities in Asia. We have other studies also which show that South Asia and Asia in particular are much more vulnerable. This one is about 10 years old, but even recent reports show the same. And you can see, so if you look at the colors, blue and dark blue reveal extreme risk, and almost the whole of India and Southeast Asia is covered in blue. And that indicates their high levels of vulnerability to climate change. This is about potential vulnerability to climate change, that is, in the future, uh, in terms of exposure to climate change, what impact it will have on economic and social systems. And the color red shows very vulnerable or high level of vulnerability, and the whole of India, as you can see, is completely covered in red, as are other countries in South and Southeast Asia. Okay. This map shows district level vulnerability, that is, which districts in India are likely to be more vulnerable to different climate related hazards, from drought to the kind of hazards that coastal areas face. And you can see that again, except for the southern part of India, the northeast, central and northern India, uh, levels of vulnerability are high or highest. And this covers all the different possible hazards from climate change, as I said. So they are likely to affect agriculture as well as other sectors of the economy. So when it comes to developing countries, the countries in Asia that we are talking of, it's very clear that the risk and vulnerability are extremely high, and therefore there is an urgent need both for more research as well as for more capacity building and for a better adaptive capacity in these countries. But there is an additional aspect that we want to focus on when it comes to developing countries, and this is that because of high levels of heterogeneity, inequality, income inequality especially, and social inequality like related to caste and gender, as well as high levels of poverty, there is a certain accumulation of risks that we are talking about. So, and this is related to the concept of emergent risk that I mentioned earlier. So, there may be migrants from rural areas who, because of consecutive droughts, are finding it difficult to survive in rural areas. They come and live in cities, and because they are poor, they may live in cities which are very marginal or fragile, which are very risky or dangerous. So, in our study, in our research on the impacts of the 2005 floods due to an extreme event in Mumbai, we found that a large majority of the people were minorities who were exposed to risk of violence from others, and therefore they chose to live in this risky area. Or there were lower castes who again could not find housing in other areas because of caste based discrimination. Or there were migrants who again, because of discrimination, could not find housing in safer areas. So there is this accumulation of risk, and populations are unfortunately forced to choose between different kinds of risk. So the social risk or exclusion from other communities happens on a more regular and everyday basis, whereas the risk and danger from climate may be less frequent, because of which they choose certain kinds of risks. And when there is an extreme event, there unfortunately these groups and communities are affected more by disasters or natural hazards than other communities. And so this idea of vulnerability is something that we in the IDP, some of us have developed this concept of prismatic vulnerability, how one's social location in terms of gender or caste or refugee status or disability, they refract the impact of a particular natural hazard. So we're saying that the impact of a natural hazard need not make everybody vulnerable in exactly the same way. That groups which are endogenously vulnerable, like the poor, the women, the children, the elderly, people with disability, they are affected more adversely. And this we see in other countries also. So an abnormally, unusually high number of elderly people are affected during heat waves and during flooding and high precipitation events in Japan. An unusually higher number of elderly people die during heat waves in countries like France, for example. So we are saying that vulnerability is not simply exposure, just to push that point one more time, that it is socially constructed. Everyday inequality and discrimination make some people more exposed to the risks of climate change related natural hazards. So we are saying that these disasters are not, like, just as we have public goods like a park or the services provided by the police or the fire brigade, there are also public bads like natural disasters which affect certain groups like the poor much more than the others. They become poorer. So this is the idea of prismatic vulnerability that we are saying, that on the right side there are groups who face exclusion or marginalization or discrimination. There is a particular disaster event. So this existing vulnerability or inequality is refracted by the disaster event into particular kinds of vulnerability outcomes. So not everybody is affected in the same way. Okay, that's what we're trying to show here. And we've used this to study the Mumbai floods of 2005, where, as I already explained to you, the government and the media tried to blame some of the poor who were living on the banks of the Methi River as being responsible, and they ignored some of the big corporates and very rich people and government offices which are also encroached on the Methi River. So the fact that people who were already at risk chose to live in these marginal areas and were very badly adversely affected in terms of lives and livelihoods and health was ignored in the larger debate. Okay? They were actually blamed for something that they were not responsible for. So this is something that is very important for us to keep in mind when we talk of vulnerability in the context of developing countries, particularly in Asia, where there are existing issues of discrimination, inequality, and hierarchies. All right. So uh, this is a summary of what I've been saying earlier, but just to repeat the point, that vulnerability is in terms of exposure to hazards, there are concepts of uncertainty and decision making, and this added dimension of the social dimension of inequality or discrimination is brought in the third point here, that people make certain difficult choices. People don't always have the ability to make choices even though they are aware of the dangers, and they chose to embrace risk. So we are slightly modifying that earlier uh, three-dimensional aspect of vulnerability in terms of sensitivity, exposure, and hazards by talking about by including the dimension of uncertainty and the ability to make choices in this definition. Okay, all right. So in actual measurement, we can actually do all of this. So we can decide on which scale to focus on, whether you want to look the local, the regional, the national. You can talk about different dimensions of vulnerability, like we've been discussing the social, the physical, uh, the vulnerability that is endogenous in terms of education, income, power, the vulnerability that is related to technological aspects, the ability to make choices, also incorporating the dynamic aspect of it, that vulnerability is not just static, it changes over time. So people who are less vulnerable can become more vulnerable, people who are more vulnerable can become less vulnerable as an outcome of the scale of the disaster itself, or because of their own ignorance or their inability to act upon their understanding of the risks. And very quickly again, these are the different indicators that one can choose to study vulnerability, and we have divided them into different categories. So on the left side you have the categories of economic activities, the dependence on the environment, demography. On the right side you can choose different parameters or indicators to measure, and we mentioned the source of this on the right column. So those who are interested in measurement can decide which kind of indicators and categories make more sense, which they are interested in, depending on their own research motivations. Okay, and within each of these categories, we can also focus on more specific sectors or groups like agriculture, or the younger population, or only the female population, or only the elderly population. Okay? Likewise, one can choose other categories and indicators related to health and sanitation. We know that a lot of climate change funds also is affected, like in other sectors, by corruption, because of which we reduce our adaptive capacity. The communication systems, education, the level of development, all of which can influence your vulnerability levels. Again, like I was saying earlier, there are certain critical facilities which function both in terms of increasing vulnerability or reducing vulnerability. So schools can provide shelters, schools can provide education which help people to understand risks better and act upon them. Uh, Hospitals or blood banks can help people in times of a hazard or a disaster, but if they are destroyed by the disaster, then they may make communities or human systems much more vulnerable. Okay, so we are saying that each of these measurement issues has to be contextualized for one's own society. Which one are you thinking of? So approaches that have been developed in UK or USA and Japan, can they just be imported here? So uh, we have to see in terms of our own governance mechanisms, what is the nature of the state, how prepared they are, how invested they are in taking climate change seriously and creating infrastructure to adapt ourselves to the hazards. The fact that a large part of the population is living in rural areas, the fact that there are large number of migrants, and we have seen how this aspect of migration is very important for managing the pandemic in COVID-19. Okay, so instead of just importing models from elsewhere, how to develop an understanding of vulnerability and come up with governance mechanisms to mitigate risk based on an understanding of the social system around issues of caste, race, migration, region, gender, and similar kinds of categories. So we will be sharing this presentation. So this particular handbook that we developed has a number of different kinds of techniques for measurement of vulnerability and adaptation. Those who are interested in measurement issues can look at these in more detail. Before I end, I just want to spend a couple of minutes on a very specific case of trying to understand climate change and vulnerability in the Indian context, especially the state of Maharashtra, where we are doing a lot of our research. So I already mentioned to you earlier the significance of climate change for enhancing the variability of the Indian summer monsoon. So, and I mentioned to you that these are the aspects that are identified by climate science about how climate change is affecting the Indian summer monsoon in terms of overall decline in monsoon, increase in variability, increase in high intensity events, in freak weather events like hailstorms and cloudbursts, in onset retreat, and so on. So these are some of the major impacts of climate change on climate variability with reference to the Indian summer monsoon. And you can see, just to show you an example of looking at number of wet spells and number of dry spells in the states of Maharashtra. Okay, so there are particular districts where you can see the blue color shows that there is great decrease in the number of wet spells, and on the right side the number of dry spells, again the blue districts are those districts where the number of dry spells are decreasing, the number of wet spells are actually increasing in the red states. So that tells us about how to plan, what kind of variability is there with reference to climate variability, and how we can plan for those. Likewise, these two maps show us about the frequency of rainfall events and the intensity of rainfall events. The one on the left, the coastal states, we can see that there is a tendency to decrease the frequency of rainfall events, which is bad news for us. And on the right side, you can see the rainfall intensity, high intensity rainfall events are actually increasing in a couple of states, but they're also and there is high level of increase in certain states, the ones that are in dark blue or purple here. So again, these are districts where these high intensity events may adversely affect agriculture or other sectors, and therefore we need to plan accordingly for these. So just to take a 20-year window and look at it across different states, we see from 95 to 2000 on the top, look at agricultural vulnerability. Within the 20 years itself, we see a lot of variability. That is, those districts which were vulnerable are no longer vulnerable. Those which are not vulnerable have become vulnerable. Okay. Similarly, below, so we are going from 1995 to 2000 to 2009 to 2005. So there is a lot of variability within short periods also. So this kind of variability is very difficult to plan for. And this is exactly what we are talking about. That climate change is not only about particular events, it's also about variability. And variability introduces uncertainty, which is much more difficult to plan for. Okay. That kind of risk management is much more difficult and requires much more research and much more investment by the government in terms of how to design strategies for to minimize risk. Right? So this is just an overall map. It talks about districts like Ahmednagar and Sholapur, which are coming out as less vulnerable, purely in terms of exposure to uh, climate variability, and those which are red are shown to be highly vulnerable. Of course, this has to be interpreted in complex terms, but we don't have enough time to go into that now. So overall, what we see is that for the state of Maharashtra, variability is emerging as an important aspect of climate change. So it's not simply about droughts or extreme events. I've already explained to you what is this variability about. We also see that districts which are already in agrarian crisis, where there are a lot of farmer suicides, are at higher agricultural risk. We also see that those districts where there is high variability, there is also a higher increase in atmospheric temperature, which has impacts on agriculture and other sectors also. And we are also seeing that the urbanization seems to have an impact on extreme rainfall events. With increasing urbanization, there are also increasing extreme rainfall events, which also have different kinds of impacts on different sectors of the society and economy. We also worked out different kinds of scenarios for different parts of the state, different districts in terms of increase in mean temperature. And we see that certain divisions of the state will have greater rise in annual mean temperature, which means there will be heat related impacts which need to be addressed in terms of strategies. We also see certain divisions which will have increase in monsoon rainfall in absolute terms, but there are certain states, which certain parts of south central Maharashtra, for example, which will have more dry days. So overall, and coastal states, of course, will have more sea level rise. So there is no one solution that fits the entire state, and therefore there is a need for a more diverse understanding and a more diverse strategy for dealing with different kinds of climate related risks. Okay. We also show, and a lot of research from others show, that heat waves could double mortality due to heat waves in different parts of Maharashtra. Waterborne diseases could increase. Grasslands, which are very important for livestock economy, there's increasing fire risk, like we're seeing in Brazil and California and Australia. Increased aridity means that livestock will be affected because reduced fodder supply. Other species losses in mangroves, fish will affect livelihoods and food security. Water availability will be reduced because of increased salinity intrusion from the sea in coastal areas. Also, agriculture could be affected by pest incidents and lower crop yields. Okay. In Mumbai itself, we are seeing an increasing incidence of extreme climate events as well as a lot of climate variability. And frequently, we figure among the top 5 most vulnerable cities in the world in terms of exposure to climate related events. And here, what we see is extreme rainfall events are going to increase, seasonal shift in terms of onset and delay in monsoon, which will also have health impacts in terms of how they affect the vectors like mosquitoes. Extreme events are going to increase. Many studies are showing this, and increasing exposure to storm surge as the sea surface temperature on the Arabian Sea increases. Studies by Adam Sobel of Columbia University and others say that the probability of cyclones and extreme events in the west coast of India is going to increase as well. Okay. Also in specific areas, because of the built environment, increasing concretization, urban heat island effects, which will have impacts on the rainfall, but which also will have effects on health. Within the city also, we see a lot of variability in terms of high precipitation events. Some parts of the city is going to get high level of precipitation, high intensity rainfall, others will not get it. And there are also a number of studies which talk about the economic impact of this. And it's being said that if we don't do anything in 10 years from now, there's going to be a tripling of this 2 billion USD loss in 2005. Okay. So together, all of these are going to create a situation where, as seen by the example of Mumbai and Maharashtra, uh, there is going to be a huge impact, and this is going to be exacerbated by lack of planning, by our tendency to ignore the costs of environmental degradation, by our tendency to put in place projects which cause further environmental degradation and contribute to emissions. And because of this, there are likely to be significant impacts on health through air pollution, through vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue, uh, and it's going to affect people who are comorbid, that is, who already have other kinds of illnesses. Okay, so there is going to be a severe adverse impact of these. So the overall context of vulnerability due to climate change is not very encouraging, and our attempts to adapt or develop a coping capacity is still at a very nascent or early stage. And therefore, it is much more important that we pay much more significant attention to the issues of vulnerability so that we can develop strategic knowledge that can be used for policy making to reduce vulnerability. All right. So I'll stop here. Thank you for listening. We can now take a few questions and try to
Yes,
respond to these
sir.
questions.
Yes, sir. We'll just start displaying the first.
Yeah. Sorry, I shot over the time a little bit. But, yeah. Thank you. So there's a question from Ravi Ranjan. Can I give some examples of emerging risks in India? So, by the way, I just wanted to say, since you use the word compound extremes, emerging risks in the literature also are referred to as compounded disasters or cascading disasters. So, one particular kind of vulnerability or disaster leading to another kind of vulnerability. So, I already gave you one example of how people seeking to escape risks because of agricultural crisis in India come to cities and they live in areas which are very risky to live in, on the banks of rivers or in coastal areas. Or even in Palghar district, we've been doing a study in earthquake prone areas in very poor quality housing. So, in trying to escape one kind of risk, okay, one kind of vulnerability, they embrace another kind of vulnerability. Okay, so if, for example, there were better mechanisms to deal with drought, to help them adapt to drought or to create employment in rural areas, they would not have faced the kind of risks and vulnerability they are facing in rural areas. So that's a kind of emerging risk that we are seeing in India. I'm going to be very brief in responding to this question so that we can take more questions. So this question from Ashmita Biswas of Sustainable Square: how to aggregate different parameters with different units? So now you have asked me a question which will take me a couple of hours to answer, because we're going into issues of methodology. In fact, Sindhuja, who's introduced me at the beginning, is working on something on this particular methodology. So you can, I'll give you a very brief answer. You can normalize them, but you have to. So there are no statistical ways of aggregating these parameters which can tell us what is the best way. So it has to be theoretical, it has to be strategic. That is, as researchers, we have to adopt a normative position. What am I interested in? Am I interested in protecting lives, reducing health impacts? Am I interested in reducing loss of livelihoods? Am I interested in addressing key risks or emergent risks? Based on that, we can decide how to aggregate and give weightage to different parameters. So, are we interested in the economic aspects? Then obviously GDP has to be, or employment has to be given more importance. If we believe, for example, that protecting mangrove cover is important from in terms of reducing risks from flooding, then obviously you have to give more weightage to that. So the aggregation of different parameters will depend on what is your own motivation, what is the policy design that you want to come up with, and which particular region or community you are interested in also, because it will be geography and region specific. Okay. Yeah. Can we take the next question or comment? Yeah. Okay. So prismatic vulnerability, thanks for asking this question. So far we have not attempted to measure this, but we have attempted to study this qualitatively. So we are trying to find out which, uh, suppose a particular group in a region or a locality is affected by a hazard. So we want to understand what would have happened if it were not for the particular endogenous factors which make them vulnerable. So we hypothesize that there are particular kinds of impacts because of a hazard that they are exposed to. So we can assume that everybody living in that particular area will be affected in exactly the same way by a flood or by an extreme precipitation event. But in actual research, we find that some are affected differently, some are affected more, some are affected less. So you can quantify that aspect of it. So what we try to do was to quantify it in terms of loss of life, loss of livelihoods, loss of income or daily wages, and loss of assets that they had, and also in terms of how much cost they incurred in terms of addressing the health impacts of a particular disaster. Then we try to find out which community is affected in what way to a lesser extent or a greater extent. And then you can try to find out how the particular disaster was refracted by the inequality or discrimination they were subjected to. Okay, so would they have been affected in the same way if they belong to a different community or a gender, if they had a different set of income? So we work out these different scenarios to explain this idea of prismatic vulnerability and then convert it into a set of recommendations for how the vulnerability can be reduced. So vulnerability reduction here, mitigation of risk is not merely in terms of technology or income or information, it's also in a social kind of risk reduction in terms of minimizing or preventing discrimination in housing, okay, or in employment or in citizenship rights like getting food through a ration card and those kind of things. Yeah, can we take the next one? Okay, so this is yeah, that's a very interesting question from Karan Mahajan. Why is it that what is the reason for low vulnerability, even though the exposure of South India is probably higher, especially to coastal hazards? Okay, why is it less vulnerable than some areas in Indo-Gangetic plains? So that is because this particular vulnerability map combines socio-economic vulnerability with exposure to a hazard. So the Indo-Gangetic plain has vulnerability in terms of the monsoon impacts, in terms of increase in temperature, but uh, they also have higher levels of poverty and higher levels of illiteracy. All right. Uh, on the other hand, in South India, the exposure levels may be higher to coastal hazards as well as to heat waves and changes in um, uh, rainfall events. But the social vulnerability is lesser because of lower poverty levels, higher literacy levels, and some other governance indicators, the presence of infrastructure, and so on. So it is because of the combination of both kinds of vulnerability that South India is shown as less vulnerable, even though exposure may be higher for South India compared to the Indo-Gangetic plains. In the last few years, apart from drought and changes in weather patterns, the Indo-Gangetic plains are also affected much more by flooding, and this is both because of human-induced reasons as well as because of climatic reasons. Okay. Um, Coastal parts of West Bengal and Orissa. So I'm not completely familiar with these two regions. This is a question asked by Cape Burman from Pune. But I'll give you one example from one of the research projects that we are involved in the Sundarbans, which is we're doing research both in the Indian part of Sundarbans and the Bangladesh part of Sundarbans. So there, uh, we know that the Sundarbans, the forests as well as the islands are under severe threat from coastal erosion and sea level rise, as well as from the extreme events like cyclones. On the other hand, there has also been a severe failure to protect the Sundarbans. So there has been deforestation. Uh, the livelihood needs of people have not been adequately addressed, because of which there is over exploitation of resources both by people living there and by external forces. Uh, Biodiversity protection has not been adequate, because of which there has been change in the species mix, and that is why many of the tigers have become man eaters there. So there is an impact of anthropogenic activities in terms of our own governance failures, our inability to prevent environmental degradation and look after the livelihood needs of the population. And there is a natural vulnerability of the region because of where it is located. So the two together are creating new kinds of vulnerability, is what we are witnessing in Sundarban's part of the West Bengal. Uh, I think you can identify similar examples in Orissa. One example which comes to mind from the work of Saudamini Das from the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. So we know that there is exposure to cyclones in certain districts of Odisha. But in the case of recent cyclones, we have seen that the cyclone impact has been much more even in interior parts of Odisha, not just in the immediate coastal areas, but even up to 50 kilometers inside. And that is blamed on the anthropogenic impacts, especially changes in the destruction of mangroves, but also changes in the plantations of trees along the coast, which act as what is called as bioshields to reduce the speed of cyclones and winds. So one example she gives is the cutting down of traditional species which were much more resilient to high winds by casuarina, which has commercial value. And casuarina is not as resilient to high wind speeds, because of which they just broke like matchsticks during cyclones, and the cyclone was able to come into interior parts much more. And this we saw in the recent cyclone Okhi also, where Calcutta was very badly affected, which was not the case with the earlier cyclones. So Calcutta is several kilometers inside from the coast. The fact that it was badly damaged is partly because of the anthropogenic activities. Okay, Karan Mahajan has this question about incorporating vulnerability to climate change in government policies. So this is a very highly relevant question in the current context because of the debate we are having about EIA, the environmental impact assessment policies. So the controversy is that there are activists and environmentalist scientists who are saying that the the rules and regulations have been diluted. There is not adequate incorporation of environmental protection measures into the EIA, the new EIA policy, because of which there is likely to be an increase in vulnerability. So even so, earlier where it was very difficult to get a license in a area which is much more exposed to a hazard, it will become much more easier because of the changes in the policies. So what is the future scope? That depends on us, how much pressure we are able to put on the government to have good policies, not only have good policies, but also implement them. So we carried out some studies on coastal regulation zone norms, CRZ norms in Maharashtra. And what we found was that though the policy is well designed, it's one of the most amended laws. So whenever they want to give license to a particular project which is not acceptable as per current policy, they will just amend the policy. One of the most amended laws in the country. It's also one of the most violated laws in the country. So I think I don't want to sound pessimistic here, but there has to be increased pressure on the government, both state government and central government, that there has to be a much more explicit focus on addressing vulnerability and on ensuring that these policies are also implemented and not violated. But to be a little bit more optimistic, I would say that while the existing laws are not being implemented very well, uh, if you look at India's agreement to India's what we have agreed to in the Paris Agreement, and also the National Action Plan on Climate Change, the state action plans on climate change, the national missions under the National Action Plan. We have 8 missions on Himalayan region, coastal region, and so on. So there is actually much more positivity there about how to address issues of vulnerability and enhance adaptive capacity to climate change. So I think there is a need to convert these national missions into actual strategies, and that is where the role of researchers and activists can be very important, because these are this shells basic ideas that government has. So converting that into actual strategies will require a lot more work, and that is where there is much more scope for incorporating vulnerability to climate change in the policies and strategies. Okay, again, this is a very technical question, and I'm actually not competent to talk about this. Neeraj's question on how to estimate agricultural drought risk, because we, as a social scientist, I'm more involved in assessing the vulnerability of farmers. So, which kind of farmers are likely to be affected in what way by droughts? Or just a second, I think my battery is running out. Sorry about that. Yeah. So agricultural drought, it depends on what you mean by agricultural drought. Are you referring to crops? Then in that case, we have to talk of moisture, we have to talk of precipitation, we have to refer to specific kinds of crops and their water requirement. Okay, and we'll talk of the interaction between um, land and atmosphere interaction, which Professor Vimal Ghosh talked of. So I'm sorry, but I'm not really technically competent to answer this question, but we'll see if we can get one of our faculty members to respond to this in either tomorrow or in the last lecture. Okay. Yeah. So does climate Shabdendu Pathak has asked a question about climate vulnerability, whether it takes into account biodiversity or ecosystem. So from the beginning, I have been stressing that we talk about vulnerability of the human systems and vulnerability of the natural systems. So we can assess the vulnerability of the natural systems from two perspectives. One, for its own sake, that the biodiversity or the ecosystem is important, not because they are useful for us as human beings, but because they are important in itself for the health of the planet, for the species, the plants, the flora, the fauna that live there, they're important for themselves. But we can also assess the vulnerability of the ecosystem and the biodiversity in terms of how they are either useful for us in the present or likely to be useful for us in the future. So we can talk about what will happen if mangroves are destroyed. Will it increase flood risk for us? What will happen to, because mangroves are important breeding grounds for fish, what will happen to fish species? What will happen to fisheries? What will happen to people who depend on fish as a source of food and nutrition? So also, if forests are destroyed, for example, forest can harbor species of plants which have medicinal uses for us. So the vulnerability, climate vulnerability also does take into account the natural systems, including biodiversity and ecosystems. Yeah. Okay, is there any workings at national, international level to accommodate climate refugees? Formally, no. This is a question again by Shabdendu. So we don't yet have an international agreement. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has been pushing for this. So individual countries have their own policies. So for example, Germany has taken 1 million refugees who are refugees because of climate, but also for other reasons. It's going to become an issue increasingly. So Professor Sudhir Chelarajan of IIT Madras has been doing a lot of work on these climate refugees, and you can look at his work. But as of now, we don't have a global or international policy or agreement to deal with this. Yeah. How to manage? You're asking a very macro question, Dhruv Sethi. How to manage drought in rural areas? So it's a huge question. So I'll give you a few points about how it can be managed. So one is, so and I'm going to give a answer from the climate perspective, not merely from a social or governance perspective, because from a political or governance perspective, we can always say that if you want to manage drought, we need to create adaptation in terms of providing more water for irrigation. So, because drought means that there is less rainfall available for the crops. So, we need to create artificial irrigation. However, the first lecture from Professor Suvimal Ghosh, he must have told you that increasing surface water through dams, canals, lakes, ponds, rivers, all of these will change the land atmosphere interactions and may adversely affect weather patterns and climate change also, resulting in specific kinds of extreme events. So, that is not really a sustainable way to manage drought. So, one has to look for other ways of managing drought rather than just provide more water. Changing cropping pattern is one of them. So go for crops which require less water. So move away from sugarcane into millets or sorghum. In somebody was asking a question about Orissa. So Orissa, the millet mission is also addressing some of the climate issues. Similarly, we suggest changing the cropping cycle, so advance the date of sowing, so that you adapt yourself to the changing onset and retreat of the monsoon. We may have to accommodate certain kinds of migration. We may have to accommodate changes in livelihood pattern, move away from agriculture to livestock, because the livestock economy may require lesser water compared to agriculture. And this is something we are exploring in one of our research projects in the Kutch area, where historically there have been certain pastoral ecosystems based on livestock, camels, cattle, sheep, which have can survive better in drought conditions. So those have to be encouraged, so that if there is a failure of agriculture, people can depend on livestock. In fact, historically, there is this organization called FES. I don't know if there is somebody from there in this among the participants, Foundation for Ecological Security, and they have done a lot of research to show that one of the reasons for agricultural crisis and why we are not able to manage drought is because earlier there was a higher level of dependence of farmers on multiple sources of livelihood. They also had could depend on cattle, on livestock, on the commons, on grassland, pasture, forests. So that has changed, whereby farmers have now to depend only on their agricultural land. So diversifying the source of livelihood, having more access to commons, maintaining and restoring the health of what we call as wastelands of forests, all of these together offer more sustainable solutions to managing drought rather than to introduce artificial irrigation. All right. So this will be a last question because it's 6:30, and this is a very. I'm glad you asked this question, DJ Rao, about which islands would be submerged fully or partially. Uh, so because we have actually done this estimation, so our team here has been part of uh, India's NatCom, National Communication to the UNFCCC. So all governments which have signed up to the UNFCCC have to give a periodic report, so to UNFCCC, about what is the level of vulnerability and what measures we have to address this vulnerability. So in the report that we gave about 10 years ago, we actually did an estimation of which are the islands in the entire coast of India which are likely to be submerged. And it's the east coast. Sundarbans, you can look up this on YouTube if you type Ghora Mora. So you can actually see parts of the island eroded and going underwater in front of your eyes. It's happening on a daily basis. Okay, so in the west coast, there are more islands that are actually getting submerged, but also in the Andamans. As yet, coastal erosion is not such a severe issue. I've been talking about the west coast. It's in the east coast. The east coast is where submergence is actually happening. In the west coast, uh, it's partly because of human anthropogenic activities, a lot of projects, ports, and others, because of which coastal erosion sedimentation is increasing. What is the effect on submergence? We have to see. The east coast is actually happening. I'll just end with this one example. So uh, we identified, purely from maps and satellite imagery and from our own scenario building, which of the islands are or even villages on the coast are going to be submerged. And then we went with our team and with the local district collector in Orissa to have a look at one of these villages. And then we asked the district collector, "Where is the village?" And he said, "There," and pointed to the sea. That village has already gone under the sea. Okay, so the process of villages, islands submerging has already started, and these are in areas where there is higher level of coastal erosion and sea level rise, but also there is change in anthropogenic activities in terms of vegetation, land use, land cover, uh, and other kinds of industrial activities, which is rapidly leading to sedimentation and erosion. So you can look up our NatCom report of 2008, which gives a list of these islands and villages, especially in the east coast. If you write to me, we can share that report with you also. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you for actively posing questions, and thank you for your sustained interest. We hope that this has been useful for you and that you can take it forward and contribute more to climate studies. Thanks again, and all of you be well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Hello. Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you very much for a very interesting and informative presentation and discussion on climate risk and vulnerability. So I'll just close this session, sir.
Yeah.
I want to thank Sindhuja, who is Professor Parthasarathy's PhD student, for handling the question. And okay, there is a feedback form which we have put up in the description and the comments section. Please do fill it for us. And again, I want to thank all viewers for being part of this e-school today with us. Tomorrow is the last day of this e-school, so we hope to see you all there. Till then, have a good evening and stay safe. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Shiba and Sindhuja.